Okay.
Our mission, Helping Parents Heal, is a nonprofit organization dedicated to assisting bereaved parents. Through support and resources offered, we aspire to help individuals become shining light parents, meaning a shift from a state of emotional heaviness to one of hopefulness and greater peace of mind. Helping Parents Heal goes a step beyond other groups by allowing the open discussion of spiritual experiences and afterlife evidence in a non-dogmatic way. Helping Parents Heal affiliate groups welcome everyone, regardless of religious or non-religious background, and encourage open dialogue. Attendance at all Helping Parents Heal meetings is voluntary. All discussions that take place at affiliate-led meetings are confidential. We hope that participants will learn from and share with each other. Zoom meetings run by Helping Parents Heal leadership are not confidential. These meetings typically feature guest presenters and are posted on YouTube so that affiliate members worldwide can watch and benefit. Neither type of Helping Parents Heal meeting is designed to replace traditional therapy or spiritual counseling. Helping Parents Heal offers a wide variety of speakers, allowing parents to learn about the many possible ways to heal. This includes presenters covering progressive topics such as afterlife evidence and connecting with children who have passed. The views expressed by our guest speakers may or may not reflect the opinions of Helping Parents Heal leaders and members, so we ask that you take from their presentations whatever may benefit you personally.
Thanks, Kathy. Welcome, everyone. It's an honor and a pleasure to welcome Joe McQuillen here this evening. I'm going to read Joe's bio. Joe has been married for 33 years and is the father of 3 children, 1 on the other side. Joe was the youngest of 10 children from an Irish Catholic family. Although Joe has had 2 successful careers, he is at heart a blue-collar kid from Buffalo, New York. Joe is himself 38 years sober and a member of AA, a fact that has helped him get close to God and help carry him through the dark times after Chris's passing. Not willing to accept a world devoid of his beloved son Christopher, Joe began to research the metaphysical and seek out the answers to what happens next. Joe's first book, it's actually Joe and Chris's book, My Search for Christopher on the Other Side, tells the story of the journey of discovery over the first 2 years. His second book, We're Not Done Yet, Pop, My Lessons from the Other Side, takes his audience to the next level of discovery and awakening. Joe speaks to parents who have seemingly lost children. He hopes to bring to them comfort and hope. Joe was honored to be a presenter in 2022 at the Helping Parents Heal International Conference held in Phoenix. When Joe finished his first book, he thought he was one and done. But Chris let him know that we're not done yet, Pop, and indeed they weren't. Joe is currently working on book 3, One Foot in Both Worlds, and a screenplay of their story. He is a longtime resident of Winnetka, is that how you pronounce it?
Yes.
Illinois. So please join me and join Kathy in welcoming Shining Light Dad, Joe McQuillen. Thanks for being here, Joe.
Well, thanks for the kind introduction, even though I wrote it. I appreciate it. And thanks, parents, for taking a minute of your time to spend time and help me spread a message that I think, could help. And even more importantly is, after I tell my story and being Irish means you don't know how to tell a short story, but I'll do my best. But afterwards, I would love a Q&A because I think that's really where the healing starts. So my story started in January 3rd, 2016. It was the last weekend after Christmas break. My son was home from college. He was 21, and they were all going to go back, the following Monday. So that Saturday night, a dozen of them went up to, live in the north of Chicago, North Shore of Chicago, and they moved up to a friend's lake house in Lake Beulah, which is maybe an hour north in Wisconsin. And a dozen of them, they went out and kicked up their heels and hooted it up, and then came back to the beach house. Now, a thing that's plagued both Sally and I is that we thought going up there was a safe option than running around downtown in the streets of Chicago, you know. So we thought maybe this is a good move. And then actually he had talked about maybe going out on a double date with a friend. And I said, that's the best move. But, you know, it was hard to keep Chris away from a party and a bunch of friends. So they went up and they did, and they got a snoot full of alcohol. And 3 o'clock in the morning, 4 boys went outside and saw some canoes, and 4 of them with a snoot full of alcohol, layered clothing, uh, you know, the invulnerability of a 21-year-old. They jumped in a canoe, all 4 paddled out, and none of them made it back. You know, I was waiting to watch a football game with him at home. You know, I grew up in Buffalo, as I was sharing with Kathy and Irene, and big Bills fans. So he was going to come, you know, get back and spend the night and come back Sunday, watch the game, next day go back to school. So I got a text that said, Mr. McHugh, you know, Chris and 3 friends are missing. So I jumped in the Jeep, threw my Labrador, grabbed her leash, and we jumped out in the car and drove up. And halfway up, I got a call from an uncle that said it's no longer a search, but a recovery. All 4 had drowned, you know. And you know, the thing about talking to parents like you all is that I don't have to explain what that moment means, whether that moment's, you know, a fatal disease or car wreck. That moment when you're facing the reality that your child's no longer earthbound, you know. I will also tell you that I was familiar with almost nothing metaphysical, almost nothing. So I was kind of in shock driving up to now what it is to claim his body. And I thought back 15 years before when I'd actually gone to a medium, and I don't know if it was out of a spiritual quest or a lark or whatever. And the reading was kind of mundane because there was nothing really out of place. I had, you know, my mom and dad had transitioned, but you know, they were of an age that it wasn't that out of place. And I had a brother that went home a little early, but you know, God called him home, and so there wasn't this sense of urgency. So I was kind of biding my time when the meter was running to get out of there. When she said, "Your dad's here, and he's holding a caboose, and he's telling you railroad." And she said, "There's a message between you two," because I don't know what that means. Now, this was in 2000. This was before, you know, internet. This was certainly before Facebook. Before, you know, nobody knew my dad. Nobody knew, you know, that he was a railroader. But if you look over my shoulder, there's a railroad lantern. My dad spent 40 years on the railroad. My brothers and myself all worked on the railroad during college. I stayed on after I left school as a brakeman. We were a railroad family. So when she said that, I thought, interesting, you know, and it's something I just put away for later on. Well, later on was January 3rd, 2016, when I'm driving up north and thought, wait a minute, if my dad's somewhere, then my son's with him. And I thought, I just need to figure what that means. And I had no idea what that means, you know. So, you know, I went up and they wouldn't let me claim the body. To this day, I mean, I'm looking out my window in this bedroom, and I'll explain this bedroom to you. I'm looking out and I can see the boats, the lights, the divers, you know, all looking for those four beautiful boys. And and they wouldn't let me claim the body. They wouldn't let me see the body. They in Wisconsin they only do photos. So I had to wait for the body to be shipped back, and I had all of the details that go along with what we've all had to deal with, right? There's telling the family, calling from up there. There's going home and getting people in, you know, getting a reception, you know, a wake, a mass. Who's going to read? You know, get a suit for his younger brother. You know, all of those things came into play that those couple of days after he transitioned. And I would go to bed after just hours and hours of details and work. And I get on my knees as I always do since I've been sober. And I would say to God, thank you for keeping me sober. Thank you for my family, but we're not good. I said to him, you took my kid. This happened for 3 nights. And then the third night, I got in bed after telling God that he and I were not on the same page. And I got a download that said, I didn't take your son. His recklessness and free will caused him to come home early. And I welcomed him. And remember, I lost a son too. And at that point, I knew that God wasn't moving us around like chess pieces. And I wasn't paying for my past sins, which were a reasonable number, that this is where free will came in. And later on, only through the help of Helping Parents Heal, that I find out about past life regressions and how many times we've done this and soul contracts. And so that was my mission. My mission was to find out if there's something. And if there's not, scratch it off the list. Figure out some other way to feel better, right? And that put me on the path, and the path was, calling mediums, going to hear them speak, research, books, spirit circles. I mean, I pounded all of this in, and every step of the way, I got more evidence that what I wasn't familiar with was real. Just because I didn't know about it doesn't mean it doesn't count, right? In my narcissistic thinking, so I had called the medium from 15 years before, and she actually talked to me, and she said, I don't know if I can connect with Chris. It's so soon. But she did, and she told me exactly what happened in the accident, things that I didn't know until I got the medical report. But then I got a little greedy, and I thought, I want to see a medium who's looking at my son in person. And so I decided to see a guy named Andrew Anderson, and we've become friends. And I saw him, Bob Olson's book, which I thought was just outstanding, especially for a man, right? Especially you can just relate to that. And we all share, all of our souls are broken, but it seems like society and our own upbringing says it's okay for women to break and hurt and heal, but guys are supposed to suck it up, and it's nonsense, right? I mean, to this day, when it's time to cry, I cry, and then I move on with my day, right? And I'm pretty sure it doesn't make me less of a man, So I through this Bob Olson, not even knowing it was through him, I went on the website, I looked up this guy, and I did a couple of things. So, and if you read the book, you'd got it, or if you heard me speak, I actually moved my son over one grave. So he was he was buried in January of, in the North Shore of Chicago, right off, 2 miles from Lake Erie or Lake Michigan, which means that it was cold and icy, and the ground was covered in snow. So when we picked out 3 grave sites, the woman said, where do you want to bury him? And I said, here's nice on the end near I wasn't thinking too much about it. And when they buried him there, and then when the snow melted, he was buried next to another family, another couple, and it looked like he was their kid. And that wasn't going to do. It just wasn't going to do. So I had him moved over one plot, and I'll occupy the plot. Actually, I'll get to it. But my Labrador, Cassidy, his gal, his girlfriend Cassie, my dog, is right next to her. Her ashes are there. So we moved him over one. So the dirt around his grave was loose. So I had ordered shamrock seeds from Amazon, and they came. And so I thought, okay, I'll take the morning off, stop at the grave, plant the shamrock seeds, head out to this, talk to, a little bit to Chris, head out to see this medium. We'll make a day of it, right? And so I did, and I went and I planted the shamrock seeds. But before I left, I pulled this out of my dresser, and it's a leather bracelet that says Dad with the logo of Goofy we were in Disney World when he was 5 or 6. And I put that on for the first time in 15 years. and I put it on my wrist, kind of like this, like, under my sleeve, and went and saw this medium, Andrew. And the first thing Andrew said to me is, he said, and he knew nothing but my first name. He said, your family was together last night celebrating something. What was it? And it was mine and Sally's 25th wedding anniversary. And he said, your son's here. God, he's gorgeous. He's beautiful. He said, I want you to know that, he enjoyed life, but there was dark sides when he was sad and he didn't want to be here, and Sally and I knew that, I think he'd overprescribe himself with partying to try to mask any kind of depression or sadness. And he said, but your son wants to acknowledge two things: that you were planting something at his grave, and that you're wearing the bracelet he gave you. Now, Irene was just talking about a medium that she had just seen, who had just nailed it with, why they're called evidentiary mediums, right? With evidence that couldn't go any other way. Nobody in this planet knew I planted those seeds that morning. My wife didn't know. Believe me, I'm not a serial shamrock hiding planet guy, or planter guy. I just didn't tell her, and to this day, by the way, shamrocks come up. And it was on a whim that I grabbed that bracelet and put it on. But that was the moment. And I think if we all look back, and if any of us have had this awakening, right, that was that aha moment when it went from believing to knowing. I was listening to Marianne Williamson, and I just adore her. I think she's just amazing. And a couple of years back, off of Siesta Key, I heard my wife listening to she was a meditation with her, and she said, we all have one purpose. We have only one purpose, and that's the one that God gave us, right? And so my purpose started coming together at that moment, that I figured that I needed to find him, and he's given me evidence to keep me walking one foot next to the other, like following the breadcrumbs, right? So that was the moment. And then on his anniversary, so I'd continued this, going and seeing mediums and reading and research and trying to acquire in a year, a lifetime of absolute ignorance of the metaphysical. And so on the anniversary of his crossing, I was sitting at my desk. Now, this room used to be his bedroom. So there's I'm a big fan. I've done a presentation with you guys on thin places, and I'm a big fan of thin places. And I think his energy's here. He was happy here. I feel him here. So I'd gotten up during the first year. I started coming in my office at 3:00 in the morning. I'd light some sage because I heard that it cleanses and it's good for meditation. And I'd align my chakras, and I gave Kathy and Irene chakra chart to share with you guys, and steps to connect, and I would light candles, and I put Siesta Key sand, which is quartz crystal, around, and I would listen to a guided meditation. And it ain't that grand. And I'd feel better, and I'd blow out the candles and go back to sleep. And on the anniversary's crossing, January 3rd, 2017, 3:00 in the morning, I did all these things and started getting a message back. And he said, Dad, you won't believe this place. The colors, it's beautiful. It's in the greens, the blues, nothing hurts. Everything's good, and it was, I just grabbed a pen and started writing it down on a legal pad that was on my desk. And I got about 2 or 3 pages, and at first I'm wondering if I left the reservation. I didn't know anything about spirit writing or automatic writing. And all I knew is I was getting downloads, and it's not a two-way conversation. I was getting downloads, and I started writing it down. And the one thing he said, and one of the reasons I knew it wasn't me just trying to put a Band-Aid on my grief, he said to me, you got to let go, Dad. I love Scotty. He loved me. He was my pal. It wasn't his fault. So Scotty was the kid who owned this house on the lake house, no supervision, and they had, canoes. Now, come on, guys. I wanted to blame somebody, and I'm Irish, and they say Irish Alzheimer's is where they forget everything but the grudges. So I was holding tight to this. Somebody was responsible. Let's blame Scotty's parents, right? And then he said to me, "That's not the way, Pop. That's not the way." And the truth was, it could have been in my house easily. I would love to say that there weren't hockey parties where my son's team, I go out in the backyard and they're on the garage shooting out hockey pucks. So it's not like I run this disciplined home. Yet I wanted to blame somebody. And he said, "It's not good for you. You got to let go of it." And so I thought, okay, Chris, for you, I'll let go. I'm okay with that. So I finished this meditation. I'm looking, wondering still what just happened. And that morning, later on that morning, I got a call in the afternoon from one of Christopher's friends, who said, "Mr. McHugh, a few of us are going to meet at the grave. Can you join us?" And so I grabbed a hockey cooler with some beer and Gatorade and box of cigars. Figured, 7, 8 kids, and we'll pass the day talking about my boy. I got there were 50 kids, from every level, from his childhood to his high school to his college. 50 kids all there, just to honor my boy. We do that every year, still coming together, believe it or not. And one of the first kids I saw was Scotty, the kid I was trying to hold a grudge with. And I knew that Chris did two things. He healed my heart. And he prepared me for this, that I didn't have to turn my back on this kid. I could embrace him and say, "Scotty, it wasn't your fault. Could have been anybody's house. Chris loved you, so do I." And I knew then that what happened was real. So this still to this day happens, where I'll get nudged out of bed. Now I'm 67. I'm an old man, and sometimes not easy to go to bed, but it's always worth it. And there's times that I fall back asleep, and the next day Chris will say in the session I'll have, "Dad, it doesn't matter. Time's your side. We don't have time. We don't have time. Yesterday is as good as tomorrow is as good as the next day. None of that matters to us." So I started getting all of this. I started recording all the mediums. I started recording. I took all of these visits with Chris, and I put them in a legal pad and put them in a file folder by date. And I figured I was just gonna do this so that when I'm old and grayer, I don't know if I can sit on a rocking chair and go through these wonderful visits. And then I got a message that, that's not what this is for, Pop. You got to be an ambassador, because you don't look like you would be one of those. You don't look like you subscribe to the metaphysical. People need to hear my story through you. And that's when I decided, okay, I didn't decide, I was told, we got to write this book. And so I combined every visit, every medium session, every connection, every Lily Dale to Arizona to thin places, anything that I could do to try to fill the void and get some answers. And that was the first book. And I know he's proud of it. And as we said during the intro, I was feeling a little melancholy. How's that for an Irish term there, Kathy? I was feeling a little melancholy. And as I was finishing up the book, I had no idea what I was going to do with this book, by the way. In fact, I thought it was a book. I later on found out it was a manuscript, That's right. I thought what I was writing was a script, and I found out it was a screenplay. So I'm a slow learner. But I started finishing up, and I thought, well, what if this connection starts diminishing? What if our project is what kept us together? And that's when he came to me and said, "Don't worry, Pop, we'll be writing until you cross," and that was the second book, And so, I know now that I will be writing and sharing, and that I'm going to be living out the purpose that God gave me. I often wondered, as a reckless young man, nobody gets to be 38 years sober without being reckless early, right? I often wondered, I had a couple of brothers, I had friends that died. I had a few brothers that died, before their time. And I always wondered why I was given a hall pass, right? And, I wasn't that good of a ambassador to AA, although I'm very open about it. But it was only after Chris fulfilled his soul contract that I realized what my job was supposed to be this last lap around the track was sharing that message, that they're not gone. They're still here, and there's things I'm going to say there's things I have to do. And those are the steps to connect. You got to realize that, I'm here on the emotional scale and the energy scale, and Chris is here. So I got to raise my level of energy, and he's got to lower his so that we can meet in the middle and he can connect. People ask all the time, did you ask him this, ask him this? And those 3 a.m. meetings, that's not for dialogue back and forth. I'll do that with a medium. Those 3 a.m. meetings are me getting dictation from my son on the other side, telling me how to live and maybe sharing a word or two with others, right? That what you did matters. And most recently, we had this great session, and he said, listen, Pop, all of you are so tough on yourselves. And you think about the missteps you made, the times you yelled, the times you didn't show up on time to pick up the kid from, baseball, whatever, all those things. I have them, he got into a car accident and I, yelled at him. I mean, like, not proud. I was very angry. And I can't reverse that. I can't take that back. But what he told me in that visit was all the things that you did, birthday parties, the going to the beach. We remember every minute. It's like love air flowing over us. That's what we remember. And you got to give yourselves credit. And Dad, you got to tell them to let it go, that we love them and we only remember what was good. And I thought, what a loving message from my son. One of the last things I want to talk about is when my amazing sister, Marcia, who was one of my favorite people in the whole world. She was Christopher's godmother. She transitioned in 16 or in 19, excuse me. And he said, Dad, when she goes, I'll be here. I promise she won't be alone. And so when she transitioned, he said, he came to me the next night and I had a medium call me and say, just described my sister that she had transitioned over and talked about a photo of her and Chris. It was in the middle of a collage, evidence, right? And she said that she had transitioned due to cancer. And he said, look, Pop, when she crossed over, she joined the family. We were all here, but then she had to go somewhere like a spa. And when she came back, she was younger than when I was a kid. And what that tells me is that although the cancer stayed with the body on this side, the trauma crossed. And then there's a healing place that we go to, like a spa. And then we rejoin the family, the soul family, and then we go about our spiritual lives on that side. When she was transitioning, and I just adored her. I was with her a few days before she made the final journey. And she said, she looked up to me and she said, Joey, honey, you gave me the greatest gift. I read your book and I'm not afraid to die. A couple of days she transitioned. This is from somebody who was such a source of love to me, even when I wasn't lovable, believe me. A year later, I saw this wonderful medium, Jill Nicole. And she said, well, your son's here, but there's a woman here who's dark hair, glasses, described a haircut when she was teaching high school. And she said, did she call you Joey? I said, yeah. He said, because she's saying, Joey, thank you for the greatest gift. And I thought, what better gift could I have on my birthday than a message from somebody I love on the other side? But I also got to say that we've got to do the work. We've got to do the work. We've got to meditate. And I think that's the key to it. I have ADD. I'm a type A personality. I'm like the ever ready bunny. Yet I find my connection to Chris and to my God through the meditation process that takes me It gives me to a level where I can connect with my son on the other side. So I think, as I promised, I spoke too long. But, to this day, I get my visits with Chris. I still go see wonderful mediums. I wrote down the name of the gentleman that Irene just saw. I'm still seeking it out. I want to be prepared. And I will say that, I have no fear of death. Now, I'm not done. My daughter's engaged, getting married next August. My son, but if I got tapped on the shoulder and it was, hey, Joe, you're playing second base tomorrow on the other side, I'm okay, because I've had this amazing gift here, this wonderful life with people I love. And when I cross over, I'm going to be with my son again. So I live my life two ways now. I live my life to please my God and make my son proud. And if every decision I made is based on those two tenets, I'm going to be okay. And I can't wait to hear your questions. Thank you.
Oh, that's just so beautiful. And everyone, please, this is for you to ask Joe questions. So you can just raise your hand if you'd like, or raise a virtual hand. Everybody can unmute themselves if you just want to unmute and ask a question. Joe is just such a great speaker, and he has it's a wealth of information for all of us. I just love you, Joe, and I love Chris. I really do.
I know.
I make it a point to get to know all of our children,
Yeah.
and it's just such an honor to do so and to do that. And what you said, I say every morning when I wake up, what can I do to honor Carly, and what can I do to help someone else? And that's how I live my life. And I love my life. I never, after Carly passed, I never could imagine saying that I would love my life again.
Yeah.
And like you said, we know when we close our eyes on this side, they'll be waiting for us on the other.
Not a bad deal.
How cool is that?
I know.
I'll wait for people. Yeah, Kathy?
I was just wondering, Joe, you used the term a couple of times, a thin place, and for people who don't know that term, you can explain what you mean by that.
I do. And there's a Celtic saying that heaven and earth are only 3 feet apart. But these thin places, the distance is even smaller. Thin places not only make us feel calm, but also transform us as if we're being unmasked. While we're at these places, we're aware that we're far more than just physical beings. We feel ourselves as a spiritual being, our true essential selves, body, mind, and soul. The thin places can be found anywhere on the planet. So, I read this in a I think it was John Holland's book, and I immediately said, I need to figure out what this thin place is. And it's simple. It's the description. It's where the veil is thinnest. Now, for me, the place that I find where I found the thinnest is on Siesta Key Beach in Sarasota. Now, what I didn't know at the time was, you can walk on that beach and it's 95 degrees and your feet don't get hot. And the reason is because it's quartz crystal. It's not sand. It was flown down from the Appalachian region 2,000 years ago. And so it's white quartz crystal. It's 96%. And when I first read it, I thought it was hokey BS. And so I researched the heck out of it. And it's true. So those are the places that I feel Chris actually walked through me in the first November after his transition. And I was all brand new to this and still surprised, which I'm not by any of this anymore. I know Chris is around. I feel him on my shoulders when he's here, and he's right here. And that's a thin place for me. A lot of beaches, but not really beaches on lakes for some reason. Naples Beach, I feel them. There's this room is a thin place. The grave, the spirit's very strong. The grave there. I had a medium say to me, he said, "Do you go to the grave a lot?" I said, "Yeah." He said, "I usually tell parents, don't bother doing that, but I'm telling you, it's just a great place for you two to connect. It's just a spiritual place. I would bring my dog and we would go to the grave, and friends and kids and neighbors would leave little crystals, trinkets, mementos. So I keep it clean as a whistle, right? I bring a little duffel bag with tools, and I had a folding chair and a cigar, and we sit and do that. And so my dog would always come with me. And then last May, she joined Chris. We found a tweet of Chris the first year that he transitioned. And he said, there's two things in this world that I love most, my mom and my dog.
Mm.
And so when Cassidy transitioned, we had her ashes, and it was a wonderful death, wonderful crossing over. And then I took half of her ashes and a spade and went to the grave. And I got there, and they were all doing some kind of renovation and cutting. And so I came back late that night and just dug a hole next to Chris and put Cassidy. And so instead of me and Cassidy go to visit Chris, I go there and visit Chris and Cassidy, and it's just
Oh.
right. So that, Kathy, is the thin place for me.
Thank you.
Oh, so beautiful.
That is so beautiful. I'm going to look up that quote. I really like that.
Mm.
I'll send it to you after I get off.
Thank you.
Joe, did you ever have a premonition that Chris wouldn't be here long for this world? Did you ever feel that at all when he
Yes.
was a child or growing up? Because I
His
felt
mom
that with
had it
Carly.
a lot, and I tried to not acknowledge it. And I was very successful at not acknowledging a lot of things. And Sally said in her eulogy that trying to hold on to Chris was like trying to hold on to water. And she was always afraid he would go early. And I didn't know jack squat about soul contracts. And I do now. I'm far from a legal expert on soul contracts, other than I'd like to renegotiate mine.
Yeah.
But Chris's contract was, and it was his third NDE. His contract was to leave early, and to make an impact, on others, through his message, his journey. So when I get down or I feel like, the world's gone a little square shape on me, I'll read some emails or reviews where people say that, what we wrote has changed how they approach their lives. And they now believe, and they now know that their kids are with them. And okay, buddy, our work is done. Right. And so I know that we're on the path, whether we reach 5 people, 500 people, 5 million people, we're doing what we're supposed to do, him and I. So we'll just keep on chugging.
Yeah. I mean, I had a medium say, well, what if your entire soul contract was just to connect and help one person, which it could be.
Yeah.
And the rest is all just gravy, so to speak.
Right.
Right. You never know. Is Sally and your other children, are they believers? Do they connect with Chris?
Okay, great question. Sally, as a matter of fact, Sally's brilliant, and I married way over my head, and Saturday's our 33rd wedding anniversary. And
Congratulations.
And Sally absolutely feels Chris. She doesn't get what I got in the connection. And I think it has to do with soul family and Chris and I probably being in each other's lives many, many times. So Sally's an absolute believer, and she's got a book coming out in 25, and she writes so beautifully. How I write is a conversation. A compliment I received one time is I read a review that said reading his book is like sitting down across the table with a cup of coffee with this nice gentleman, and that's how I want. But her writing is just prose and beautiful. So she absolutely is completely on board, 100%. Christopher sends her hawks. He sends me cardinals. I have a cardinal on my tattooed on my forearm, and so she's on board. William is our baby, and it hit him like a freight train when his hero transitioned, and it threw him for a loop. And but we've attended some meetings together, and he's on board. He gets it. My lovely Caroline, who's 28 and getting married in next a year from August. The most she's ever said, she's never read either of the books. She doesn't get into this. The most she's ever said is, we were finally getting close, and then he left me, So she's got some healing to do before she can open up. And everybody's on their own path. right? Everybody's got to do what they got to do. So it's not like I say, hey, Sal, I'm on this Zoom. Why don't you join me? She doesn't need to hear me tell the story of her heartbreak, right? But she's healing on her path, and she's a therapist. She's certified in grief counseling as well, and she's just absolute. She's actually downtown right now watching the Stones at Soldier Field with a friend of hers. You couldn't
Oh
get me
my
there with a
goodness.
shotgun. But so I think, and Chris has come through and said he's trying to reach Caroline, and someday the wall will crumble, but it's got to be in her time, not mine.
Yeah, I hear you. Kathy, are there any questions in the chat? I thought I saw one
Come
from
on, you people.
Robin. Yeah, come on.
There was one, but now I don't see it, but it was a great question. It was, do you only connect at 3 a.m. or have you tried to connect at different times during the day?
So I thought, it's a great question. I thought 3 a.m. was 3 a.m. because he drowned about 3:17. That's what I thought. And then after I started getting involved a little bit, I realized I was told, and none of this is original, right? I'm just following the breadcrumbs here. And I was told that 3 a.m. is called the bewitching hour. So spirits are really active between 3 and 4. Why? I have no idea. There's a whole lot that's over my pay grade, right? But I believe it. So that's when I think the meditation and that I go into a bit of a trance only at 3 a.m. However, I'll meditate and feel him around and talk to him at the grave all the time, or on beaches. I feel it. I know he's there. I'll talk to him. But the trance stuff, I was on Naples Beach. I was before I went home, right before my sister transitioned, and I drove down to the beach, and 10 o'clock at night with a cigar and sit there and just feeling him around me. And I got a message that said, "Go to Sarasota, go to Siesta Key," and I'm like, "That's an hour and a half plus drive. I'm leaving in the morning, flying back home." But it was a strong message. And so I said, "All right, pal, I'm going to make you a deal. I'm going to go to the car, get my iPhone. And if the beach is open, I'll go. If it's closed," and it said Siesta Key Beach open 24 hours, So I drove up and I just felt him all. I laid on looked up at this amazing stars like nothing I've ever seen before. I felt him all around me. And I get a text from a medium friend of mine that said, "Christopher's around you. Look at the stars." Now, come on, people. I don't have a Find My Friend. I think that stuff's spooky, So nobody knew where I was, except me and Chris. And so, so there are plenty of times I connect with him, but the 3 a.m. is when I feel that trance and I feel that real connection.
Beautiful.
That is
Absolutely.
beautiful. So Sabina has said, with such strong direct connection with Chris and yourself, do you still feel the need to connect through mediums?
Oh, absolutely. And here's the reason. I can go out and I can cook up a really nice steak, or I can, but when the rubber hits the road and for a special occasion, you want to go to Ruth Chris, and that's something special about something prepared by a pro, right? I'm an everyman. I'm a generation away from being a knuckle dragger, So I've been given this gift. Now I got to tell you, there is a condition to this gift I'm given to connect with Chris, is that I got to give it away to keep it. I know that if I try to hoard this like King's Midas's treasure, I'm going to lose this connection, right? So, I share this. I share this with him, but so it's really clear to me, that the connection is based on what I'm doing with it and how I'm living my life, and that I keep the door open. I knock, I call, I reach out, and I know when I golf, I feel him around me. We're having fun, and I just feel very, very lucky. So, I go to mediums because, the same reason I'll go see a golf pro and say I'm something wrong with my drive, right? I need some help getting off the tee. feel about mediums. They're blessed with this amazing gift. I have this intuition to connect with my son. But also I'll go to a medium and my sister will come through, my dad will come through, my brothers have come through, one made amends, so I want it all. I want it all.
That's great. I feel the same way.
Yeah. What else you got? In
Yeah.
other words, what else you got? I'm in,
Yeah. Yep.
Come on, Debbie. You've been watching this whole thing the entire time. You don't have a question for me?
Yes. Come on, Debbie, unmute. You can unmute yourself.
Let's go, Debbie. You're on.
There. I've asked you to unmute. Let's see if you can do it now.
There you go.
There you are.
Thank you. Thank you. This is awesome. I really appreciate you coming on tonight. It's really touched me. My son transitioned this past April, and I have been. Well, let me go back. I've lost my stepson, 3 grandchildren, and my husband, and now my son is gone. And by this time, I've had it with God and everything else.
Yeah.
And I was very bitter, very angry. A friend of mine recommended HPH, and I started getting involved and joining all the different satellite. I've had a reading. I've done a lot of book reading. I started doing some very serious meditation, and I've had contact with Steve twice. Once during a dream where I didn't see him, I just heard his voice yell, "Mom." And the second time was I was meditating, a guided meditation at sleep through hypnosis. And I had this beautiful vision where I saw big puffy pink letters that spelled mom with hearts shooting out from the center of it. And I think I'm trying a little bit too hard and maybe doing a little bit too much, but I want to get on that path as soon as possible so that we can connect a little bit more.
I don't think, first of all, I don't think you can try too hard. I don't think the other side is worried about us being pushy. If they were, I'd have been shut out a long time ago. I'm pushy, right? I'm one of those guys, and I ask too, Deb. Like when me and God, we have this good relationship, and so when I want something, I ask. My job is asking. If he doesn't want to give it, that's up to him, right? But I'm not going to go to the pearly gates and have St. Peter put his arm around me and say, "Bro, why didn't you ask?" Right? So I'm asking. I find this loving, benevolent God in kind of a tough world. I think there's, why was Christopher allowed to survive 2 near-death experiences, and the third one, the hall pass, was yanked? I have no idea, but I think there's rules of the universe that have to be followed. So my heart breaks for you, Deb. I think, don't be afraid to try too hard or want it too much. I think that's really important. I think if you can get my email after this off the webpage, or Irene will give it to you, it's jbmcquillen@gmail. You send me your address. I'm going to send you a copy of the first book.
Oh, thank you so much. That's lovely.
Important. It's important. Okay.
But I think that, and I hate to say this, but I think that his path, like Chris's path, I think is leading me down my path because of what I've been reading and what I have been studying. I feel like, I'm sorry, God, that, I was really pissed off at you, but I feel like I'm finding my way back.
Yes. To him. To
Exactly.
him. And eventually to your son and your other kids and your family, because they're all over there. I mean, that's the one thing that I think soulmates is a hallmark term. I think soul family, is real. And we've been through lives together, 40 to 80, I'm told, with a lot of the same cast of characters, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so we're all going to be together. And I know they're together having a really nice time. And Chris said, when you come over, the circle will be complete, And we have 10 kids in the family. 5 were cousins that mom and dad took in after an accident and raised. And I never knew they weren't, my brothers and sisters until I was in like 5th grade. And so I went and saw a medium, and he said, so how many siblings do you have? And I said, I got 6. He goes, no, you got 1. I said, no, he goes, no, you got 1. I said, oh yeah. I mean, real siblings, I had 1, right?
Yeah.
And they're all on the other side, but they're together and they've missed each other. And, and they were back together, and we're going to be part of that, right?
I know.
But I
I'm looking
think,
forward to it.
yeah, but you got work to do here, right? Because there's people that say, I buy this message because the guy with a brush cut and kind of a bent nose, seemed like a straight shooter. And there's people that need to hear the message from you, but you got to do the work to connect, and don't be afraid to ask for too much. Ask your son to come through. The visit was nice, right? The dream was nice,
Oh, it was awesome.
right? Well, let's go. Let's put it on the wish list. What do you need next? A visit, an audio visit, a visit from a medium, whatever. But you can get more. It's just up to you, right?
So I'm not
Don't
stopping.
Don't settle, kid. Don't you
I'm
settle.
not.
No.
Okay.
And Debbie, please
Thank you
type
very
your
much.
email. Type your email address in the chat so I can connect you with Joe. And Kathy did put Joe's email address in the
Good.
chat.
And anybody
Okay.
that
So
wants to email, wants to chat, this is what I'm supposed to do, right? We'll find time. We'll connect. And it's not like I'm special, right? I'm an everyman. I might be just a couple of laps around the track ahead of you, in this experience, so reach out. There's nothing more important than this work that I do.
Thank you
Right.
so much, Joe. I really appreciate it.
Oh, it's beautiful. So beautiful. And Joe, we have time. We have one more question from Yelena. I think it's a great question. And I actually jotted this down, Yelena. Great minds thinking alike. Is there a specific guided meditation you recommend for a better connection?
I do. There's my favorite is and her name is Medium Kareen, Kareen. And she has a guided meditation to reach the other side, which is my absolute friggin' go-to. I have a website. It's joemcquillen.net, and it's there. And she did a reading with me a few years ago in Zoom, and at my sister's house, who was in heaven with Chris, and I was staying. I rent that for a month or so during the winter. And Medium Kareen, her name is Kareen Bobel. She's amazing. But the guided meditation is my absolute go-to and favorite. Yelena, the great question.
Yes, that is a great question.
Just
Go
go
ahead,
online
Kathy.
and say guided meditation reach the other side, Medium Kareen, Kareen. It'll come up, and it'll nail you. It'll get you.
There was one more question from it's Meg and Mike, and Meg is usually there, but I only see Mike. But they wanted to know if you still pray.
Oh God, I pray for every day for everything. I say the rosary every day, and I think.
I was wondering if you still prayed in a traditional Catholic way, given your background. And
Yeah, you know what? I wouldn't say that I haven't been in church other than a wedding or a funeral. It's not that I don't believe in it. I find, the grave is my church. This is my church. The beach is my church. And I love it when people, I have this community of people at the grave that we all know each other, and it's kind of, passing but I pray all the time, Mike. And I pray, whenever I get in trouble, I'm still not afraid to, bring in the Blessed Mother and get a little help. I mean, who says no to your mom, right? If you need something, ask the Blessed Mother, and who can say no? So yes, you know what? I pray, in a lot of my prayers. I mean, I'll say the rosary every day. Oh, most beautiful flower of Mount Carmel. I say that all the time, and a lot of my prayers just talking to God. They say that prayer is talking to God, and meditation is listening to God. So when I connect, I know that Chris has referred him as mostly as the source, but he's referred to him as God too. So I know, I got no issues with names: Yahweh, Holy Spirit, higher power, God. there's something that put this whole party together, right? This big bang all came together because somebody called it, and that's the guy that I turn to. And I know that I'll be in his realm sooner than later in my time.
I was just going to say, I prayed for our son before and after he passed. And there
Me
was,
too.
yeah, I mean, there was a period there where I questioned why I still do it. But yeah, it's good to hear you still
Because
do
God
that.
didn't take your boy. Whatever caused your boy to go, God, I feel, Michael, that when Christopher was in that friggin' canoe, drunker than a billy goat, God had his hands on his head going, oh no. And I do know that God was the only reason I was able to get everything I needed done and help others and prepare for my son, because God was holding me up. And that was the footprints. That was God. There was only one of us at that period because he was carrying me. I went from anger to absolute devotion, knowing that God's on my side. And I know that my son's with him and he loves him.
My grandfather's in Mount Carmel too. Thank you, Joe.
God bless.
Oh, that was just fabulous, Joe. Oh my goodness. This is just, you're such a blessing to so many. And you are, and we're just so grateful to have
Oh,
you as
shucks, Irene.
a part of the Helping Parents Heal family, right, Kathy?
I'm very much part of the
Absolutely.
family.
Absolutely.
Very much. Believe me when I say I get more out of this than I give, and that's for sure.
I say it all the time. Every person that I speak to, I feel like a little bit more of me heals.
Yeah. Yeah.
And also not feeling isolated, because
Right.
for so many people feel so isolated on their journey in grief. And we're one big happy family. We really are.
And when I post things on Helping Parents Heal, I don't post those on regular Facebook. I don't need normies I'm not looking for sympathy.
Mhm.
I want to connect. That's what I'm looking for. And I find it in this group. It's such a special group.
Yeah. Well,
Absolutely.
thank you for being here. Go
Anytime,
ahead,
any
Kathy.
place.
I'm
You know
sorry.
that, right?
I just wanted to let you know that Annie O said, bless you, Joe, what a gift. So there's been a couple of messages about how much tonight has meant for people.
Yeah,
God
we'll
bless you.
we'll get this up on YouTube so that everyone can hear it. And everybody, please unmute and say thank you and good night. Join us Tuesday night. Suzanne Giesman will be our guest speaker, speaking about her new book, The Awakened Way. It's going to be an awesome meeting.
And then we'll assess the next charter.
Oh, okay. So yes,
Thank
please
you.
unmute and say good
Thank you
night.
welcome.
very much.
Thank
Appreciate
you.
it.
Good night,
Thanks, everybody.
everybody.
Good evening.
Thank you.
Keep the faith, Mike.